Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada show presented by Bede Gaming. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. We have spoken frequently on this podcast about the debate over the advertising of sports betting and online gaming since Ontario's open regulated industry launched 4 years ago. Today, that debate feels as if it's now reached a crescendo. The House of Commons voted last week overwhelmingly in favor of sending Bill S211, known as the National Framework on Sports Betting Advertising Act, to the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage for further discussion. In the same week, Ontario Liberal MPP Lee Fairclough introduced a private member's bill at Queen's Park to ban most online gambling advertising in the province. Meanwhile, new research was released the same week showing 1 in 5 Canadians in Alberta and Ontario are men under 30 and links sports betting advertising to having a negative impact on young men. The research was conducted by a partnership of 5 post-secondary education institutions, along with Greo Evidence Insights, with funding provided by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Alberta Gambling Research Institute. For a conversation on the research and what happens next, we are joined by the two men who led this study. So, we welcome to the Gaming News Canada show Dr. Andrew Kim, a psychology professor at Toronto Metropolitan University and also Canada Research Chair in Addictions and Mental Health Comorbidity. And we also welcome Matthew Young, Greo's Chief Research Officer. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having us, Steve.
And Matthew, really appreciate you being with us as well.
Well, thanks for having us.
Hey, Matthew, maybe start with you, and Andrew, you can jump in here too. And, I always like when we have our guests on the podcast is just to get the background on how this study came to be and the research that's been done. And I just wonder, Matthew, was this an email or a phone call? Like, what led to the ball rolling on this research?
Well, for the specifics, I'll turn it to Andrew because he was really the one that led this specific piece of research. But I think the overall interest by CIHR in doing this work was really spurred on by the really kind of like the largest changes in gambling policy Canada has ever seen, really. With the exception of maybe just initially making casinos legal back in the 70s, I guess. But beyond that, this is really just, and so one of the things that we've been making note of is that, we're engaging in such huge policy changes with such a dramatic potential impact on public health, but we don't really have much research out there to monitor how this might impact public health. And so that's always been something that we at Greo have been talking about. But I'll hand it to Andrew for this specific project because I've been helping out Andrew, but this is Andrew's work.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think the genesis of this goes back several years before we even began the project. I was part of a meeting that I've had with the office members of, I think it was the past Minister of Health, and they were really interested and sort of worried about the impacts of gambling and gaming that was having on Canadians. So there was an organized meeting. I was part of the researchers, and there was a few others. And they're kind of asking, so what are the emerging issues that we have related to gambling, gaming in Canada? So after those discussions, it led to a funding opportunity. It was a good amount, and I should preface this by saying we really don't have a lot of gambling specific avenues for research funding in Canada, and in Ontario as well, despite all the revenues that Ontario is generating. So this provided an opportunity to apply for grant funding. They had 10 awards available for about $100,000 each. And so I thought this is a really good opportunity to look at the impacts of advertisements. I'm a sports fan. I'm a huge sports fan. And so I got interested in this topic by watching the playoffs back in 2021. And I started noticing all these advertisements. I'm like, okay, so what's going on here? Start to realize all the changes that were happening. And of course, as a researcher, I'm thinking, I wonder what the impact this is going to be having. If we're now advertising all these gambling opportunities along with the iGaming market in Ontario. So then this call came about. Started chatting with a few colleagues. I've known Dr. Matthew Young for, 12, 13 years, since our time when I was a student at Carleton University. And as part of this specific grant competition, we needed a partner, a public partner that is a stakeholder that would be interested in research. So I reached out to Greo Evidence Insights, who does excellent work. They were, of course, interested. Talked to a few of my colleagues that are in this space. And from sort of a multidisciplinary perspective, we're not all psychologists. Put in a grant, was successful in obtaining the funds. And then we leveraged a funding opportunity that was available from the Alberta Gambling Research Institute to extend our data collection to 12 months and also recruit a sample of Albertans. Before, it was just limited to Ontario, but we were kind of interested in what's the penetration to Alberta in terms of all the advertisements. And so that was about 2 years ago. We have our data now, and we thought it'd be really great to start to get some of this results out.
I guess just a follow-up, Andrew, and again, Dr. Michael Narain from Brock University, and Brock was involved in this research. Michael's been on the podcast, and he's been on our audio shows pretty much since the market opened back in April 2022, and he's certainly been beating the drum quite loudly since then to have research done around the open regulated industry and being able to provide the industry with the results of that research. But I mean, this is a real group effort, and so I did want to give you the opportunity just to highlight the partners just beyond Greo who have been involved in putting this research together.
Yeah, of course. And the University of Calgary, where I led this project before I came back to Toronto Metropolitan University, Dr. Philip Newall at Bristol, Dr. Rachel Volberg, Dr. Jonathan Krutz, who are both down in the US, Dr. Matthew Keogh, who's at York, and of course, Dr. Matthew Young. So it's a really big team effort. And Dr. Newall has published a lot on advertisements as well, created a framework of the different types. And so we had researchers from public health, we had researchers in business, Dr. Michael Narain, and we had a few psychologists. We came together, talked about what we're seeing, what we'll be interested in measuring, and put the grant together, and luckily it was funded.
I guess, Matthew, the first question as far as the actual study goes, the research looks at men under 30, and I just wonder how you get to that point of targeting that demographic, or is that something that's decided in advance and before you actually go out and start talking to those people?
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave it to Andrew to take the specifics of this study, but like it was certainly a population we were interested in because, again, given the lack of information out there on the impacts of these large policy changes, we certainly heard anecdotally from partners and everything that it seemed to be younger men that were really kind of gambling, gambling more than a lot of the other demographic areas. And we did a study, Greo, along with CCS, Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, and Mental Health Research Canada did a study back in November that we released that did show that that young adults were particularly were more likely to gamble online. And within those, we didn't publish those results, but the study also showed that young men were also disproportionately affected by gambling harms within that population. But but the specific mechanics of the study, I'll defer to Andrew, as he knows the study inside and out and backwards way more than I do.
Yeah, and so we weren't specifically targeting young men in our sample. It was a much broader study. So we recruited 1,500 current sports bettors that were defined as having bet on sports in the past 3 months. But generally speaking, what we're finding is that young men, like as Matthew mentioned, are disproportionately more likely to bet on sports. So even without targeting this specific demographic, it just became a large part of our sample. And given all the discourse, right? So Matthew's finding about young people being disproportionately affected, and the new study that came out in the Canadian Medical Journal about the rise in calls to online gambling helplines in Ontario and how it's young men, we thought it'd be a good opportunity to look at the data that we had and see what does it look like for young men in our sample in relation to advertisements. And if you look at the contents of sports betting advertisements, we could argue that it's geared towards that demographic. And so we wanted to look deeper, more nuanced into our data. So it wasn't part of the specific, but just given who sports bettors tend to be, it just became a large part of our sample.
Just to help me and our listeners, can one of you just kind of define what advertising, what it encapsulates for this study, like all the different types of advertising?
Yeah, so it was broad and multifaceted. So we were interested in not only things like brand awareness, so that's just your generic BetMGM app telling you that we exist, this is what we offer, come bet with us. We're also interested in looking at whether different advertisements have a stronger effect than other types of advertisements. So financial inducements and sign-up bonuses, right? Deposit $20 now, we'll give you $50 worth. Live odds, so this is a current odd for this game. Responsible gambling messages. We were interested in, do they have much of an impact or perceived impact among participants in our sample? We're also interested in, where are they seeing the ads? Is it on TV? Is it on billboards, social media? Do they see a celebrity? So we looked at a wide array of different ads that people may be exposed to.
Is your iGaming platform ready for market expansion? Bede Gaming is ready to support your needs across jurisdictions with the SOC 2 compliant platform, scalable multi-tenant infrastructure, and unlimited configurability. Book a meeting with Bede's team at the upcoming SBC Summit in Toronto and future-proof your growth plan. Andrew or Matthew, was there some information like, one topic that gets debated sometimes is young men. A lot of young men aren't watching games on television anymore. If they're getting their advertisements, it's probably over social media, because they're watching TikTok video or Instagram highlights or whatever. And of course, we know how the ads pop up on those platforms. But were there any common denominators in the research about, was the people you were talking to, were they seeing more ads on one platform?
Yeah, so we're shifting through the data. So this is all still things that we're working on. And, on TV or watching sports was a very common one. But you do see a shift that younger participants reported more seeing ads on social media. Every time I log into TSN, like on the app to check a score, like I'll get an advertisement, they'll say bet now. And so, yeah, I think one thing we should be mindful of is not just talking about regulating whatever form that looks like advertisements, just as it relates to live television broadcasts or billboards. I think it needs to be a bit broader than that, because advertising has changed with technological and social media.
Matt, I'll ask you this question, and again, we had a link to the research in last week's newsletter, but I just for our audience, if they haven't read the newsletter, haven't seen the results of the study yet, like what are the, what came out of the study? What really strikes you in terms of what the research uncovered?
Well, I think this study that TMU and Andrew's leading is part of a puzzle that's really piecing together an emerging picture of what we're seeing within the landscape. And what we're seeing is not great. Like there's just increasing harms out there that are associated with specifically online gambling. And one of the things that we noticed too is that even though the majority of the ads are focused on sports betting, when you actually go dig into the iGaming data, most of the people are gambling on casino gambling games. Right. So it appears as though people are going on to place a bet on sports, so they're getting funneled into online gambling casino style gamblings on apps in their pocket, and those are where the gambling operators make more money off of those games. And we're just seeing an increasing increasing evidence from the study dripping out to show that the impact on the population is just not great. We We initially saw the study that we released of young adults. There's been a study that in the Canadian Medical Association journal that Andrew mentioned about especially young adolescent males, like the number of calls for help to the Ontario Problem Gambling Hotline have increased significantly since Ontario liberalized its markets back in 2021. We also saw there was a journal story that happened that was put out a little while ago that identified how bankruptcies, gambling-related bankruptcies, have increased significantly since the changes as well. And so, and then there's the research that Andrew and the team and the group of us have put out with that just 1 in 5 sports bettors are men under the age of 30, and there's significant harms there. So what we're really what's really kind of showing is, so one of the things that I think we didn't recognize is when the changes happened, we thought it's really important to try and get people who are gambling on illegal sites to start gambling on legal sites, right? This is the line that we hear constantly this is the rationale for a liberalized market and everything. The problem is that argument doesn't show the complete picture from the public health perspective. What we have is there is dangers associated with people gambling on illegal sites, but there's also dangers associated with the commercialization of gambling. So when we didn't only just shift people from gambling illegally to gambling legally, we also just grew the market, and that's to the benefit of all the operators for sure. They're making lots more money, but we also know that as more gambling occurs within a population, more harm accrues within that population, and because this specific kind of increase in gambling is concentrated among young people, mainly young men, the harms are concentrating among young men, and this is clearly shown in the research that Andrew has produced in the last little while.
When I talk to people in the gambling industry, Matthew and Andrew, they'll talk about, as Matthew mentioned, the number of calls to problem gambling lines, and they'll say that information is more available now, and people actually know where to get help. I just wonder what your response is to that.
I'm not surprised that they would say that, but so we'll be presenting data. It's currently under review now, but it will be presented at next week's conference, the Alberta Gambling Research Institute conference, where it's part of the AGRI National Project on Gambling and Problem Gambling Canada's National Study of Gambling and Problem Gambling. It includes data from CCHS, Stats Canada, and we collected data in 2018, and then we reran the same study in 2025. And that's going to be probably the best evidence we have about how the gambling participation and rates have changed, not just federally in Canada, but can make interprovincial differences. And those data will speak to, when I saw that, and I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. That could explain why there's been an increase in calls to Ontario Problem Gambling Helpline. And if that's the argument, then we should see the same trend in other provinces, right? But there's some signals that some of the changes or increase in potential harms is concentrated in Ontario.
Matthew, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, my background is kind of substance use epidemiology and looking at this stuff. I don't see any data supporting that. I mean, if that is the argument, I'd like to see some evidence to support that. It is a convenient argument for a group that has a vested interest in increasing gambling, right? So then back it up with evidence and we can chat. But I don't see that. There's no evidence to suggest that that's what's causing it.
The one stat, Andrew, that surprised me a little bit from the results of the research was, I think, the 54% who see live odds presented, and I'm a bit fascinated that, because I think the research also unveils that I think 77% of the people you surveyed, they see the advertisements, and that doesn't surprise me, because there is a lot of advertising out there. We see a lot of around sports broadcasts. But the live odds, and I just wonder, can you maybe talk a little bit more about how people are getting those live odds?
Yeah, so we need to dig more nuance into the data. But my assumption is that they're likely watching sports, right? With the in-play betting just being more highly involved. Anytime I watch a sports broadcast, I see live odds. I remember when one of the first things I ever noticed was during the second intermission, Cabby had a whole segment on live odds. I'm like, why is there an intermission show about gambling odds? Right? I sometimes see it too when I log in on TSN. Like I do see them, how odds change, but likely those people that are seeing them are probably watching the game and probably actively betting.
This, I don't know if you have an answer to this question, and either one of you can answer this one, but I just wonder, you talk about anxiety in the research, and I think, as a father of 3 children and coming from a big family with lots of great nieces and nephews now, I kind of see the impact and influence that social media has on young people. And I just wonder if gambling is just another layer of that anxiety that comes from, we see young women posting pictures on Instagram and young women feeling like they have to try to compete with that. And I just wonder, maybe I'll start with you, Matthew, like, are there similarities or there's a correlation between that anxiety we see on some social media platforms and what we also see from the gambling space?
Well, I mean, there's certainly similarities, right? They all occur on your phone. They're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They operate with some similar mechanics. There is the one thing though that separates gambling apart from that is that you can lose your family's savings in like on it, which isn't necessarily the same that can happen to you on a social media platform. But some of the mechanics certainly kind of there is those similarities, and there are some people who hypothesize that maybe online gambling is particularly problematic among young people because young people's brains have been kind of trained and primed in this kind of social media type environment, and so a lot of younger people have grown up with the dings from a like and a lot of those kinds of things happening. Then you add on top of that kind of a gambling element, random reinforcement, and the potential to lose money on credit and other things. Then it can be a potentially very toxic mixture.
Andrew, was there some forms of sports betting advertising that were more attractive to the people you spoke with than the other forms? Like, was there a pattern along those lines?
That's an excellent question, and we did try to look into that. And so what we did is we did something called a correlation analysis. That's just looking at the association. So that's one increases, does another variable increase. So it's not causation, but we looked at sports betting frequency and the different types of advertisement, and they all seem to be, of course, there's like differences in like the numbers, like 0.2 versus 0.25. But if we look at it in terms of magnitude, there didn't seem to be as much differences as we thought we would see. And so it just seemed that as there's a relationship between how often someone sees a gambling advertisement and how often they bet on sports. I will caution that to say it doesn't mean that one causes the other. There are data out there from other jurisdictions that point to a causation, but our studies are correlation. And, part of this is that I think it was 3 years ago, I was asked to potentially be part of a panel for it was like an industry sponsored conference. And there were people on the call talking about how there's no evidence that advertisements have an impact on sports betting. And I think lobbyists in the UK and the House of Commons have also made that argument. And, at that point, I can say yes. There's not many longitudinal studies. So to be able to demonstrate that causation, you need to have very rigorous methodological design to show that exposure to advertisements now increases your sports betting behavior in the future. It takes a lot of resources and money to do that. So yes, technically true, But I also would say, these companies are not stupid. They're not spending millions of dollars in advertisements if it's not increasing their player base or not having an impact on bottom line. And so that's also part of like the rationales why we want to do this study. And research lags behind what happens. And I think, the onus is always on us as researchers or public health to demonstrate evidence of harm. I'm always curious why the industry doesn't have to demonstrate safety or that there isn't harm before something is implemented. And because we don't have as much resources, it takes us years to be able to start to produce said evidence to show that. So this is something that Matthew and I think we're all interested in back in 2021. And 2026? And we're starting to see some of that data that we've been able to produce. But also, if that grant funding mechanism didn't happen, or if we didn't get that grant, these results don't happen either, right? So we're always sort of catching up. And I do think maybe perhaps the onus should change on who is demonstrating what. And as Matthew said, if they have evidence that it doesn't, and they show us robust evidence as a researcher, scientist, I'm like, okay, cool, that's actually a rigorous design. And I wonder why. I wonder why it's not having an impact. It's not like I would say, I don't believe that. If it's well done and there's evidence to back it up, happy to take what the data says.
Yeah, maybe to jump on Andrew's point too. I mean, I know this is a bit of a ridiculous example, but nobody's forced to show causal association between advertising for Big Macs and McDonald's advertising expenditure. We don't hear people kind of just say, well, just because what's the association here? So it's kind of like people wouldn't spend the money on advertising if it didn't increase amount gambled by people and the number of people involved in gambling. To Andrew's other point of the research base, I think that the other challenge in this is just that not only is it hard to come up with these kinds of arguments that with the research that's being done, but there's also just to underscore again what Andrew had already said. There's a lack of funding for the research that's done in this space, and which I think is very problematic given when you think about how much money is being generated in this space, than to not have independent research checking to see what impact this is having on public health and being able to report back in an independent way. I think that's a big problem. The last thing I wanted to say too was, it's probably going to sound like, probably going to sound to many of your listeners and stuff like this, Steve, like it sounds like we're what people would call anti-gambling. I want to kind of address that because we just came through about 20 years of stable problem gambling rates, stable gambling rates, where a lot of people, Andrew included, and a lot of colleagues had done a lot of work with the Crown corporations, with others, to try and develop what at the time they were calling responsible gambling strategies and kind of things to make things. And these were really effective, honest engagements. They were good. They were they largely were working. I think we could probably look back and say they're working. Everything changed when the Safe and Regulated Sports Betting Act happened and Ontario opened its markets, and the online gambling market in Ontario became liberalized, and all of the transnational corporations rushed in to compete for market share. That was what changed. And so when people kind of hear a lot of the things that it's specifically that I have to say, I say, no, I'm not anti-gambling. I'm just anti too much gambling. I mean, the thing is just like alcohol, we have to, you don't want everybody drinking all the time, just like you don't want everybody gambling all the time. You want to kind of, so there is a role for public health in this space. And it's really important as a regulator or as an organization who thinks about these things, is what are our goals here? Are our goals just getting everybody from the illegal market into the legal market? Is our goals revenue? Or is public health have any role in the regulatory environment in what we're trying to accomplish? And I think that those things are oftentimes in tension, because if you want to make gambling safer, you have to make it happen less often. it's they're like how I don't. It's kind of like an inconvenient truth in this space. You just have to have less gambling, less harm in the population. And then we have another issue in this specific instance where we're in right now, where it tends to not only just be increased harm, but increased harm among our youngest people. Like we're not in a really good space right now, and we're not going in a good direction.
I mean, it does certainly when this market launched. I think Andrew referred to a minute ago. There was a gold rush when this market opened in April 2022. You had operators come in with massive advertising and marketing budgets. Andrew, you mentioned Cabby and Sportsnet took a lot of criticism around Hockey Night in Canada in that first year because it just felt like there was a bombardment of sports betting ads. The Canadian Gaming Association it has said that advertising has slowed down since that initial rush, and I think we've seen that. The responsible gaming messaging, that's kind of been something I've beaten the drum on almost since the beginning, where I thought that responsible gaming messaging was almost like a token, a token thing that happened. And I was talking to someone earlier today for teeing up another podcast and recording next week, and we were talking about the tiny lettering at the bottom of an ad around to how to contact Connex Ontario or gamble responsibly. It feels, Matthew, like almost like we forget sometimes that this is still a very young industry, regulated gambling in this country, and online gambling is still fairly young, and it's not too late to have some course correction and for all stakeholders in an industry to work together and put some guardrails in place, and to your point, to try to make things safer. And we see, the government of Ontario has stepped up with the Responsible Gambling Council they put out a new campaign at the beginning of April that's targeted towards young people. And I think research that the two of you have led the charge for will play a role as well. And we have a market opening in Alberta in mid-July where, there appear to be some lessons learned by what's happened in Ontario. But, I think there is an opportunity for the industry to get together and to address some of these concerns, Andrew.
To echo what Matthew mentioned, we're not anti-gambling. Just think there are ways that we can minimize the harms. When you offer an addiction, and gambling is an addiction, people are going to experience harms. But to what extent can we minimize that risk? And opening up the entire market without any of the guardrails, I don't think was the best choice. And in Ontario, there's a lot of things that could have happened if they wanted to. For example, limiting the amount of operators, putting in universal self-exclusion, making data mandatory available, like I think Massachusetts does. It makes the data available to researchers. There's a lot of things that could be implemented while still expanding the market. And yeah, it's a young market here in Canada, but why would we think it'd be any different than other jurisdictions that have gone through the same thing? UK and Australia. Is there no thought that, okay, let's see what happened there. Why do we think it'd be different here? And it's not. We're kind of seeing some of the trends go that way. I do think it's not too late. I don't think it's ever too late to course correct. And I do think there are things that could be implemented where you still have sort of this open market that currently exists, but perhaps more guardrails. And I think there's an announcement that the Ford government provided $8 million to RGC, and they have those advertisements. But I'd be curious, as a researcher and scientist, I'd want to see what the impact of that is. Can they provide data to show that it's had an impact? And it's also, I'm not sure if it would be as helpful to have one organization control all those funds, or have some sort of a mechanism where other independent scientists could apply for said funding that is peer reviewed independently, and sort of the research projects that have good merit, scientifically rigorous, are then funded. And that's sometimes the model that we used to have in Ontario Metropolitan Gambling Research Centre. And Ontario used to be one of the leading academic markets for gambling research. It was one of the places where we did one of the best research. Alberta is probably the only one that has that right now. We'll see if that changes with the Alberta market opening. But yeah, I think there are things that can be done to reduce the likelihood of harm.
I think that the trick with there's a couple of different challenges when it comes to the idea of responsible gambling messages. The first being the idea of gambling responsibly has flaws in it. Like it's problematic in the sense that, first of all, it can be very stigmatizing to people who may encounter problems gambling, because if you're not gambling responsibly, what are you gambling? And that's problematic if you're somebody who does end up developing a gambling problem. It's very stigmatizing. It decreases likelihood of seeking help. It's very because you're irresponsible, right? The second thing is how do we think that, like, so the challenge that I have is let's just think about it in another field. What if you had just some other field that said that you were like do something, and then one out of every 100 messages is do it responsibly. So one of the things is that if we did actually think that we want to have messaging is the ticket to safeguarding people from harm, it should be equal, right? Like, I mean, that, like, it should be. So, I mean, so it just doesn't really make sense. The issue is that online gambling should be legal, it should be available, but it shouldn't be pushed on people, because it should be just like it really, in some ways, the cannabis experience is kind of like it's not perfect, but it was a pretty good model, and we could have followed it in this, right? Like, we legalized cannabis, people can get cannabis if they want it, but we're not kind of advertising cannabis during every break in a hockey game and advertising it every time somebody picks up their phone, right? And because if we did, we'd see a lot more harms associated with cannabis-related harms. It's the same with online gambling. This isn't rocket science, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And I'll speak to the data with responsible gambling. Is we ask people their perceptions, right? How much do you think seeing ads influence your gambling, sports betting? And they say fairly it does, but responsible gambling, when we ask them to what extent did that responsible gambling message influence you to moderate your bets or not bet, they said not really. And part of it, and I think you said this, Steve, is that it's a tokenism. My colleague, Dr. Philip Newell, who's part of the team, calls them essentially brand awareness. They don't have much substance to it. What does gamble responsibly mean? And especially when the regulations change and athletes can no longer promote gambling, they just move to responsible gambling, but it's still brand awareness. I remember seeing Connor McDavid in one of those advertisements. I logged on to, I believe it was BetMGM, and Connor McDavid's nowhere to be found. So I think it's because they have to do it. What can we do that will meet our regulations and requirements? And this is where I think the onus is that, it'd be nice if it's not falling off to like Matthew, I, and other researchers to demonstrate this isn't effective, rather than on the flip side, industry demonstrating that it is effective. Maybe it's a bit of both, right? It shouldn't just all fall on us as researchers.
Hey, just a couple more questions, guys. Matthew, for you, and I think a quote in the TMU press release on the research made a reference from you about public health policy, and I think that's something that's really, really, really important and has maybe been missing a bit. And I think there is an onus on the government that is taking in, I think, a couple $2 billion in tax revenue since the market opened. And I don't think that includes the revenue coming in from OLG, that there is money that could be steered towards addiction programs or mental health programs. And that, it seems to me it would be an easy step to identify the problem of gambling as a public health concern. Is that, am I framing it the right way?
Yeah, I mean, there should minimally be kind of like a portion of the funds that are being brought in that are dedicated to research, prevention, and treatment. Like that's just minimally. The UK just moved in that direction, and it needs to be the funds pulled in need to be also independent, like independent from the industry. It can't be voluntary funds donated by the industry. I mean, the thing is like private for-profit gambling companies need to grow their markets for their shareholders. They're not evil, they're not bad. They're just that's what they do, and that's what they need to do. The thing is, though, is we in public health shouldn't be naive enough to think that our interests align with theirs. They're in contradiction, and anything that says otherwise is just incorrect and problematic. But that doesn't mean that. So what you just need, there needs to be the appropriate fences and guardrails, like Andrew said, just to kind of make sure that everybody's doing their job and is equipped to do their job. And one of the ways of doing it is to cordon off a certain portion of the funds and put it into independent research, prevention, and treatment, like the UK's done. Yeah.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And again, we have this expansion of online gambling in Ontario and just in Canada as well. And I think as a flip side to that, because we know that when you make something more readily available, the likelihood of harm increases. So to try to mitigate that, putting in resources to at least try to prevent that tide a little bit. I don't think it's really happened here in Ontario. It used to be a hub for gambling research, but now it's not. Prevention, treatment, I think some resources that are funneled, and as Matthew mentioned, independently managed, right, by an independent organization. And of course, stakeholders could have a say in what they think would be helpful, but it's just sort of independent body. So let's go through all that firewall and safeguards. And I think that'd be really helpful.
Last question, guys. I just wonder how do you, and again, the listeners of this show, they're regulators, they're operators, they're gaming suppliers. It's basically, all sectors of the gaming industry. I would like to think either watch or listen to this podcast, but what's the message to them in terms of the research that you've done, and what is it that you would like them to pay attention to? And Matthew, I'll start with you so we can get the last word to Andrew.
Well, I think the research that the teams produced here is a growing body of work that we, like many of us, had predicted many years ago when we saw what was happening, right? Like there was a report we put out with Greo and CCSA that was a call to action saying, this is being set up, we're going to encounter problems. And then now we're seeing the data, we're encountering problems. So this was predictable. It was predicted, and now it's coming through. I think that it's just like there is I think people need to understand that gambling is like alcohol or cannabis. It is a product that, when used as intended, harms a certain portion of people, and also those harms extend off. And you can't just grow the market without growing the harms associated with it. So what you need to do is I think what we're going to look back on this time in our history as a time when we let social media and gambling just grow kind of too much until we were able to rein it back in. I don't know how that reining will happen and how quickly it'll happen. And in the meantime, there's a lot of people making a lot of money. Yeah, I think that's. I'm not really sure how to end that way, but I'll pass it to Andrew.
So what I would say is that for those operators and regulators that are really genuinely interested in trying to minimize harms, there are things in the research that can show us how to do that. Now, it's going to be incompatible with maximizing profit, but I think there could be a fine balance where you could put in safeguards, guardrails, and still make a profit, maybe not as much as you could without these safeguards. But there are things in the research that you could do now and implement it that will reduce harms. It's whether they're willing to do that or not, or if it's compatible with their mandates.
That is Dr. Andrew Kim from Toronto Metropolitan University. He's joined by Matthew Young from Greo Evidence Insights. Hey, guys, really appreciate you doing this. I will include a link to the research once again in the Substack post that goes out with the podcast. But appreciate your time and your insight and shining a brighter light on the work that Andrew, you, Matthew, and your partners have done here.
It was our pleasure.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us, Steve. We appreciate it. And yeah.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show presented by Bede Gaming. As always, you can listen to the podcast on the various podcast apps. You can also watch the conversation between Andrew, Matthew, and myself on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Thank you to all of our listeners and viewers for your support of Gaming News Canada, and we will see everybody again very soon.